What is mindfulness?
I think of mindfulness as bringing this awareness to whatever's happening with an attitude of curiosity rather than getting caught up in, habitual reactivity. This awareness gives us this space to respond skillfully to what's happening rather than getting caught up in the push and pull of cravings and other things.
I mean, from that definition, it's kind of clear to us perhaps why it's so important, but to the average guy on the street, because I think mindfulness has a reputation of almost being hippy dippy, like it's not for me, it's for someone else, it's very spiritual. If they were to approach you and say, why should I even get involved in mindfulness?
Well, my one word answer would be science. It's really about, the historical origins of this stuff are scientifically based for thousands of years. Some consider the Buddhist psychologists to be the first scientists to really look at the mind. There's been a lot of, hippy-dippy-ish relationship to meditation and things like this, but, this was really about understanding our minds and using that understanding to help us change behavior, not get caught up in things and to suffer less. So there's a ton of science, both, historical as well as, my lab's been studying this for 20 years and really uncovered a lot of the things that line up between the ancient practices and the modern day science. Do
you think it's partly the fault of modern day science in the sense that we've become so obsessed with its its drugs, its operations, it's things that we can understand, and a scientist says, yes, this is it, that we've become so obsessed with that we've almost neglected and forgotten that we discovered a lot of this stuff many years ago?
Yes, I think sometimes people think of science as a modern day religion where they say, oh, somebody did a study on this, it must be true. Science is helpful for proving things and disproving things, but just because somebody does science, it also doesn't mean it's true. So I think we can also see this as, we find this middle road between, science as religion and these ancient practices as a religion, and really look at them for what they are. These ancient practices are practices to help us understand the mind. Modern science helps us prove and disprove theories and hypotheses, and we can actually bring these two together to take the best of both.
You also had a really nice quote where you're saying, I've got it written down, if we don't know how our minds work, we can't work with them. And I think it's so bang on. We don't really get taught how our minds work. Do you see that as part of the problem when it comes to mindfulness? So do you see a lack of respect for mindfulness? And do you think a lack of education is part of that reason?
I think it extends beyond mindfulness, where people try all sorts of things to change behaviors, and they're just kind of shooting in the dark. They're walking into a dark room and there's just kind of feeling around and like feel one wall, and they have no idea what size the room is, what's in there, or anything. Really going back to the origins of how our minds work. This is like flipping on the light switch so we can see what the territory is. And once we see what the territory is, then we can learn to work with it.
Are there any other positive effects that come from mindfulness that immediately jump to mind?
Well, there are a number, and some of them have been pretty rigorously researched. So I'll name those to start. So for example, depression, mindfulness training for depression has been shown to have really nice efficacy. It's even incorporated into the national health system in the UK. Anxiety, a lot of good studies that have been replicated with anxiety. Stress reduction, chronic pain, to name a few. My lab has done some work in developing some digital therapeutic modalities, so some newer ways to deliver mindfulness training. And we're also starting to see a scientific evidence base develop around those as well.
And I guess, again, this kind of goes back to the communication and the education of mindfulness. When we talk about it, and it made me giggle, your TED Talk where you were saying that you went to these universities, you work hard, you're intelligent, and you were sweating in the middle of winter, trying to just focus on your breath. Mindfulness, is it something that you're born with, or is it something that you could develop? You talk about having the people that run these camps, were they born with it? Were they just naturally gifted, like an athlete is naturally fast? Or is it something that anyone can develop, basically?
Yeah, I think awareness itself is something that we're all endowed with, and that attitude of curiosity that comes with awareness that brings, when we bring these two things together, we all have. And so it's a matter of recognizing these and seeing what the rewarding properties are so that we can just bring these conditions together rather than trying to brute force or white knuckle it. I'd struggled for 10 years to try to force myself to meditate, because I was using my willpower kind of Western mindset to say, okay, this is how I got through college. This is how I got into medical school. Well, I'm going to use the same thing to develop my meditation practice. But I hadn't actually realized that, probably how I got through college and into medical school and through medical school was actually being interested in the subject matter and being really interested in learning. And it wasn't as much about willpower. When I started to understand how my mind worked more, I started to see that it was actually bringing these conditions together, bringing awareness and curiosity together, where I could naturally concentrate on things for hours at a time, long spans of time without any effort at all. And this is really at the heart and the heart of mindfulness and the essence of the practice. I just didn't know it. There's another example of me not knowing how my mind worked. Once I knew how my mind worked, it became so much easier, so much less effortful. And that's actually, we've taken those insights, studied them, and even brought those right into simple ways to teach people how to be mindful. These digital therapeutics, whether it's smoking or eating or even anxiety, we've developed these app-based programs where we are even seeing, 5 times the cure rates of gold standard treatment for smoking. We're seeing 40% reduction in craving-related eating. We're even seeing, close to a 60% reduction in clinically validated anxiety scores in multiple studies with our unwinding anxiety program. So to me, that was a critical aha moment to see, oh, this is how my mind works. Can we actually, take this and deliver it in bite-sized pieces? And is there real clinical efficacy there? And the short answer is yes, there seems to be.
What makes it so interesting about curiosity is that it's this amazing quality that almost gets just, if you're a kid, you should be curious. When you're an adult, you should grow up, do your job, and just get in line. What was it that led you to that point of curiosity?
There were a couple of things. One was that, some of these ancient psychology writings, even back from the early times of the Buddha, had talked about interest, or liberally translated curiosity, is actually a way to drive concentration in a way that's not effortful. I didn't really understand it until I really got it experientially. And then the second piece was, we started looking at this in my lab, and I started realizing that curiosity actually feels much better than things like craving or things like getting caught up in anxiety. And so that lined up beautifully with how we understand, reward-based learning and these differential rewards that come from different parts of the brain. So when those two came together, and then I started seeing people in our app-based mindfulness training programs actually talk about the power of curiosity themselves, I was seeing this play out in real life. I was like, wow, this is it. And then the more we teach it, the more people say, wow, this is like a superpower. It's pretty amazing.
And I guess for what would be really interesting to know is, obviously, if people they hear this and they think, this is for me, I'm going to give it a go. Because it's not like school where we're going to study this and this and this and then take a test, you get an A+, brilliant. It's harder to gauge if you're making progress. Are there any particular signs or symptoms that people may experience that will suggest, oh, you are making progress?
Yeah, I think broadly speaking, and we even see this in our Eat Right Now program for eating, and even our Unwinding Anxiety program for anxiety, that there's this general framework where, cravings or anxiety or worry, they all feel more contracted or closed down. Whereas curiosity, kindness, connection, they feel more opened up. And so from a very simple standpoint, I think there's a universal language around, when we feel closed. When we feel fear, we feel closed. When we feel joy or curiosity, we feel open. So this is something that we all know. We don't have to be trained in, but it's something we can look at in our own experience and see, oh, when am I closed down? If I'm trying to perfect a piece of music, for example, I grew up playing the violin, and if I was trying to force myself to nail a passage, in a violin concerto, it got harder and harder and harder as I clenched down and tried to do it. But later I realized if I just relaxed and opened to it, I could learn, I could procedurally learn it much more easily. And then I could actually get into it and just enjoy the playing in that expansive, more open, connected way when I wasn't worried about it. And I found that this was especially the case when I was playing, quartet music in my quartet where there's just this small group of people just there, completely connected, open, as compared to, oh no, I want to make sure I play in tune.
And I think this leads quite nicely into the sense of listening to your body's natural operating system, where you don't really have so much control over it, but it's really helpful to just kind of observe and see how it's doing its thing, which leads really nicely into what you and your team discovered with the embedded caveman loop, the survival loop, which we've very usefully manipulated into seeking sugar when we're stressed.
Yes.
I'd love to hear your perspective, a bit more detail about that discovery.
Yeah, in a nutshell, this process has been known for a long time. So it's I think B.F. Skinner was one of the most famous psychologists that was known for this. It's called, reinforcement learning, where you have a trigger, a behavior, and a reward. So you see food, that's the trigger. You eat the food, that's the behavior, and then your stomach sends this dopamine signal to your brain that says, remember what you ate and where you found it. So that's kind of the reward from a brain perspective. So that's been known from a survival perspective for a long time. What we connected the dots with was seeing that, and we and others have found that this habit loop gets perpetuated when we eat because we're stressed, or when we're, we think of this as, hedonic hunger rather than homeostatic hunger, as in we eat because of our emotions rather than because we're physiologically hungry. So there's been a lot of research showing that the connection that we found was that this actually was described 2,500 years ago by some of these ancient teachings. And it really was mind-blowing for us. We're like, wait a minute, these two they're the same thing.
Yeah.
We even published a paper, showing the parallels with this. And then we extended that to test that hypothesis to see if we could actually target that habit loop as a way to help people step out of unhealthy habits, whether it's smoking or eating or anxiety, into more healthy habits such as connection, or, the ultimate in music is flow, where we're just totally, we are the music rather than we are playing music. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. And I think it's so, you talk about flow, and I think it's something that every artist, every professional is pursuing. And I think understanding the environment that allows for that to happen. And I think it leads on really nicely to the next question. Obviously, you mentioned you have your one killer song that you can smash on the guitar. So as a music maker, you'll be aware of the industry. There's so many pitfalls that people can fall into, and the environments do put an untold amount of stress on an individual. Late night touring, late night gigs, very unpredictable. Are there any specific benefits that you think music makers would experience by adopting mindfulness and adopting this mindset?
How much time do we have? There are tons. I think the first one is around, one of the big questions I get is around performance anxiety, where people have learned to associate anxiety with performing well. But my PhD mentor used to call this true, and unrelated, as in we could have anxiety and we could perform well, but they may not actually be causally related to each other. We don't necessarily need to be anxious to perform well. And in fact, and I've seen this in my own experience and many others, is the anxiety can actually get in the way of performing well. When we perform well, we're not anxious. We're just we lose our self-consciousness. And when we're really in flow, we kind of merge with the audience or the environment or the music, and we lose this sense of self. So, mindfulness can be really helpful in helping us see when we're starting to get caught up in worry or fear. Often it's future related. Oh no, what's going to happen, or this or that, and to let go of that type of stuff. It can also help us when we are trying to meet a deadline and we think, oh no, I have to learn this piece by this amount of time, or I have to write the song, before this deadline or whatever. And the more we start worrying about those deadlines, the harder it's going to be to actually get those tasks done. So mindfulness can help us notice those, step out of that, and then just into the process of being, kind of doing through being, rather than trying to force something to do.
That would I wish we'd have had this conversation at school. That would have been very helpful.
For me as well.
There was another really interesting part that again carries on from what you were saying and in your talk, where we have this, it's the cognitive brain, I believe you called it. This really beautiful but quite young part of our brain, which is giving us all of our funky, new things, new gimmicks, new upgrades. But it also has the useful trait of being the first to go offline, as you put it, which I think is a really nice way of putting it. And then obviously the default caveman brain takes over and starts bashing away at things. Is there anything that we can do when we're in the real world, when we're in the field, to limit the negative results if that situation does arise?
Yeah, there are a couple of things that we can do that are pragmatic. One is to, again, just know how our mind works. And so if we know that the prefrontal cortex, which is that doing part of the brain, is trying to get in there and try to force something, we can notice, okay, what does force feel like? And kind of get curious in that moment. Oh, here I'm feeling contracted, I'm feeling closed down. And can we actually bring some curiosity to that moment to help it kind of unwind a little bit? The other thing we can do is just notice, when our prefrontal cortex is going offline and we're getting stuck in habits, to be able to just kind of take a step back, and rather than try to, just muscle on, to really step back and ask what's needed. Often it goes offline because we're hungry, because we're angry, we're lonely, we're tired, whatever. With this acronym in addiction treatment, HALT, hungry, angry, lonely, tired. Those are some of the reasons that the prefrontal cortex goes offline. But basically, anytime we get stressed, it goes offline. So instead of trying to force ourselves to get it back online, we can step back and say, what's needed? Do I need to take a break? Do I need to rest? Do I need to eat something? Are there ways that I can nourish myself, rather than try to just muscle through it?
So we've spoken a lot about stepping back and being aware and being naturally curious. Are there any other things that music makers or just people could do in general in parallel with curiosity? Or is curiosity the main thing and that just feeds everything else?
I think the only other thing I would suggest is to bring in some kindness. I wouldn't say, here are 10 things to do, because that's too much. And it actually boils down to anything that leads to contraction, not helpful. Anything that leads to expansion, probably helpful. Mm-hmm. So, we can think of this as curiosity and kindness, and have that curiosity kindness checklist and say, am I being hard on myself, or am I being hard on my team? Is this helping? Right? Yeah. Just as a way to step back. And then the curiosity. Am I actually being curious in this moment as compared to trying to force something? And the nice thing there is, if we're not being curious, we can get curious about what not being curious is like right in that moment.
I'd love to, if possible, dive back very quickly into examples where, and I know you've done studies with people smoking. I'd love to just get a bit more detail around what you found with smokers or with heavy drinkers using this mindfulness and this curiosity mindset.
Yeah, it taught us something really fundamental about how the mind works, and kind of reinforced some of these theoretical concepts that I'd learned, in my scientific training, but hadn't really landed clinically. So, as a young addiction psychiatrist, I was trying to kind of help my patients work with cocaine addiction or alcohol or smoking or whatever. And, the brute force just wasn't working. Just stop using cocaine. And like, I've tried. Yeah. So we started looking at other ways to approach that based on really understanding how our minds work. And our minds work based on this reward-based learning thing. It's not based on behavior, because if it were, we'd just stop overeating or stop stress eating or stop using cocaine. But it's really based on the results of the behavior. What happens when I eat junk food? What happens when I smoke a cigarette? And so that result is what forms the behavior, and it actually gets chunked as a bit of information, and then we just for easy access and acting out on, through habits. So basically, we learn to smoke when we're 13, when we're being rebellious, or thinking we're cool or whatever. And then, years later, we're not actually paying attention to the result anymore. So we have people start by bringing awareness into the actual act of smoking, and we have them pay attention. What's it taste like? What's it feel like going into your lungs? What's it smell like? What's the smoke smell like, and all this? And they realize that smoking actually tastes like shit. And so that reward value gets updated in their brain in real time. They're like, wait a minute, this isn't actually that great. I remember a guy who'd reinforced this process over 40 years. So he'd reinforced this habit loop about 300,000 times.
Jesus.
And we had him pay attention, and he's looking at this cigarette like, how did I not notice this before? He's like, I can't believe this. He hadn't realized how not pleasurable it was to smoke a cigarette. And that in itself helped him, become disenchanted with the behavior so that he could start to, in a non-effortful way, start to break the habit. We see the same thing with overeating or stress eating. When people really pay attention, they realize, feeling guilty about eating and having my stomach be bloated doesn't actually feel very good. And we find, even in our, we've done some studies with our app-based mindfulness training programs, that we have some specific exercises built right into the apps to help people do this. After about 15 times, that reward value goes from very high to almost zero.
Wow.
And so we can actually measure this as that reward value drops. And then it's much easier for people to change that behavior because it's not that rewarding anymore. As they pay attention when they're about to do it, and they think, what did I get from this last time? Not very much. It's much easier to step out of that habit loop.
I've actually come to the end of all of my questions. I have one final one. But if you had any comments at all or anything you wanted to communicate that we haven't touched on, it would be amazing to hear that. If not, I'll power on with the last question.
I think just keeping in mind that kindness and curiosity are key is a great way for all of us to get started with this. And we've packaged things into app-based mindfulness training programs, but I think anybody can start by just waking up to any one moment and checking in to see with themselves, am I kind, am I curious, or am I caught up in something and contracted?